The day Lucy Langley rode into Millhaven, Texas, the summer of 1882, she did so with a busted wagon wheel, 17 cents to her name, and the particular kind of exhausted courage that only comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. The town itself was not much to look at. A single main street, baked pale by the relentless July sun, stretched between two rows of wooden buildings that seemed to lean against one another for support. There was a general store, a livery, a barber shop with a cracked mirror in the window, and at the far end, a saloon called the Dusty Spur that announced itself with a sign painted in letters so faded they were barely legible. Millhaven had the feel of a place that had once hoped to become something more, and had since made its peace with the alternative. Lucy climbed down from the wagon seat with the kind of careful dignity that said she was aware of being watched, even before she had confirmed that she was. 3 men on the porch of the general store had stopped whatever conversation they were having and were staring with undisguised curiosity. A woman in a faded blue dress paused outside the barber shop, her eyes moving over Lucy's dusty travel clothes and single battered trunk, with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to measure a stranger's circumstances at a glance. Lucy was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair that had come half loose from its pins over the course of the day's travel, and green eyes that had a way of looking directly at a person that some people found unsettling. She was not classically beautiful in the way that parlor paintings celebrated, but there was something about her face, something in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze, that made people look twice and then think about her afterward. She had come from San Antonio, where she had spent the previous 2 years working as a seamstress and occasional schoolteacher's assistant, and before that from a small farm outside of Houston that had belonged to her parents until a drought and a series of bad harvests had taken it from them. Her mother had died of fever 3 years prior. Her father had drunk himself into a quiet grave 8 months after that, leaving Lucy with the farm's debts, his good boots, and a piece of advice she had turned over in her mind many times since. He had told her that the world owed her nothing, and that the sooner she understood that, the better equipped she would be to take what she needed from it anyway. She had been trying to take what she needed ever since, with mixed results. The reason she had come to Millhaven specifically was a notice she had seen pinned to a post outside the San Antonio post office, written in the careful hand of someone who had composed it several times before settling on this version. It had read, "Seeking a woman of steady character and practical ability to serve as cook and housekeeper for a working cattle ranch, Rocking W., 3 miles east of Millhaven, Texas. Accommodation provided. Inquire with Elijah Winslow." Lucy had no particular attachment to San Antonio. She had no particular attachment to anywhere, which was the problem and also, she supposed, the solution. She had written a letter that she hoped struck the right balance between competent and not desperate, though she was aware it had leaned more toward the latter than was ideal. Mr. Winslow had written back within 2 weeks, which she had taken as a good sign. His letter had been brief to the point of being almost curt, but it had confirmed the position, the wage, which was modest but reasonable, and the fact that accommodation was a small room off the kitchen that had its own door to the outside, which he had underlined, as though anticipating that she might have concerns about her privacy. The underlining had made her decide to come. She had not anticipated the wagon wheel giving out 6 miles before she reached the ranch, which was how she found herself standing on Millhaven's main street with a borrowed horse, a trunk she couldn't move without help, and the growing suspicion that this plan, like several of her previous plans, was going to require improvisation. "You need help with something." The voice came from her left, from a man who had just stepped out of the livery stable and was wiping his hands on a piece of cloth. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from years of physical work rather than any deliberate cultivation of it, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else. He wore a faded gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and work trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a battered hat pushed back on his head in the way of a man who wore it from habit rather than concern for appearance. His face was angular and weathered, older than young but not yet old, somewhere in his early 30s she guessed, with several days of dark stubble, and eyes the color of strong coffee that were watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize as either friendly or unfriendly. It occupied some neutral space between assessment and mild curiosity. "My wagon wheel broke on the road coming in," she said, because it was true and because she had learned that honesty in the first exchange was generally more efficient than the alternative. "I left the wagon about 6 miles back. I'm looking for someone who can go out and fix it, or at least retrieve my trunk from it." "What's in the trunk that can't wait?" "Everything I own," she said, without any particular inflection. He looked at her for a moment. "Where are you headed?" "Rocking W Ranch." "I have a position there." Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't quite read. "Is that right?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Do you know it?" she asked. "I own it," he said. There was a beat of silence. "Mr. Winslow," she said. "Miss Langley," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The three men on the porch of the general store had now stopped pretending they weren't watching. "Well," Lucy said, because someone had to say something, "I apologize for arriving in this particular fashion. I had planned for a more organized introduction." Elijah Winslow looked at her with that unreadable expression for another moment, and then he said, "Wait here," and turned and went back into the livery. She heard him speaking to someone inside, heard the clank of tools, and a few minutes later he emerged leading 2 horses, one of which was already hitched to a light buckboard, with a tool kit strapped to the back. "Get your horse," he said. "We'll go get your things." They rode out to the wagon in something that was not quite comfortable silence but was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who were both practical by nature, and saw no particular reason to fill the air with words that didn't need to be said. Lucy noticed that he rode with the easy economy of someone who had spent a great deal of his life on horseback, the kind of rider for whom the horse was an extension of thinking, rather than a separate problem to be managed. She noticed also that when they reached the wagon, listing badly to one side in the rut where the wheel had given out, he examined the damage without any audible expression of opinion, got the tools, and set about fixing it with a focused, efficient competence that she found unexpectedly reassuring. She helped where she could, holding things when he needed a second hand, and he accepted her help without comment, neither insisting she stand back nor making anything of the fact that she had waded in without being asked. When the wheel was repaired and her trunk had been checked and secured, she climbed back onto the wagon seat and he mounted his horse, and they made their way back down the road toward the ranch. The sun was getting lower by then, throwing long orange light across the grassland that spread out on either side of the road, and the evening was beginning to breathe cooler air up from somewhere in the south. Lucy watched the landscape and thought about what she had gotten herself into, as she had thought about it several times on the journey from San Antonio, and arrived at the same conclusion she always did, which was that she had gotten herself into the only available option, and that was that. The rocking W was bigger than she had expected. There was a solid 2-story ranch house, a large barn, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse set apart from the main house at a respectful distance, a well, and a corral where a dozen or so horses were moving in the last light of the day. The land around it was well kept, the fences intact, the yard free of the accumulated debris that often gathered around working ranches whose owners had stopped paying close attention. A man came out of the barn as they rode in, a lean, weathered Mexican man of about 50, with a wide mustache and the alert eyes of someone who missed very little. "This is Diego Reyes," Elijah said, dismounting and handing his horse's reins to Diego without any particular ceremony. "He runs the horses and generally keeps things from falling apart." "Miss," Diego said, with a brief, respectful nod. "Diego," Elijah continued, "Miss Langley's trunk needs to go to the room off the kitchen." "I can carry my own trunk," Lucy said. "It's heavy," Elijah said. "I know how heavy it is. I packed it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. There was a quality to the silence that was, she thought, marginally different from the silence on the road, charged with something that might have been the beginning of amusement on his part, though he did not, in fact, smile. "Diego," he said, "help Miss Langley carry her trunk if she asks for help." Diego's mustache moved in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Si, jefe." The room off the kitchen was small but clean, with a narrow iron bedstead, a washstand, a small table, and a window that looked out over the back of the property toward a line of cottonwood trees along a creek. The floor was swept. There was a fresh pitcher of water on the washstand that she suspected had been put there in preparation for her arrival, which meant that Elijah Winslow had thought to do it, or had instructed someone else to, either of which suggested that he was more organized about the matter of her coming than his spare correspondence had implied. She stood in the room for a moment after setting down her traveling bag, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening, the horses, the distant voices of the men from the bunkhouse, the low of cattle somewhere further out, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the possibility that she might stay somewhere. She pushed that thought away with the efficiency of long practice and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was large and well-equipped for a working ranch, with a good cast iron stove, a solid work table, adequate pots and pans, and a pantry that had been stocked, though not with any great imagination. She took stock of everything with the focused attention that her mother had taught her, and that 2 years of managing her own household, such as it had been, had honed further. When Elijah Winslow appeared in the kitchen doorway that evening, she had already lit the stove and had a pot of beans with salt pork going, biscuits in the oven, and coffee ready. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the stove, at the coffee pot, at the organized state of the counter. "I wasn't expecting supper tonight," he said. "There was food in the pantry," she said. "Seemed a waste not to use it." He came in and sat down at the kitchen table with the directness of a man who was used to sitting at that table and had not, she suspected, had company at it in quite some time. She poured him coffee and set it in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around the mug in a way that seemed almost unconscious, as though the warmth of it was something he'd been needing without knowing it. "The men in the bunkhouse cook for themselves," he said. "There are 4 of them right now: Hector, Billy, Pete, and Tom. Tom is the youngest. He's 18 and has opinions about everything. I'll warn you in advance." "I'll manage Tom," she said. "I expect you will," he said, and this time she was almost certain there was something at the edge of his mouth that wanted to be a smile. Over the following weeks, Lucy Langley settled into the rhythms of the rocking W with a thoroughness that surprised even her. She was up before dawn each morning to start the stove and have coffee ready for Elijah, who rose with the kind of habitual earliness of a man who had never, she suspected, in his adult life needed an alarm clock. She cooked 3 meals a day, kept the house, mended what needed mending, and very quickly, through a combination of capability and a certain measured warmth that she deployed with instinctive precision, made herself indispensable in ways that went beyond the strict terms of her employment. The ranch hands were, as advertised, a varied collection. Hector was a solid, quiet man of about 35 who did his work and spent his evenings reading a battered Spanish Bible. Billy and Pete were friends from somewhere in New Mexico, who competed constantly at everything and were fundamentally harmless. Tom, the youngest, was indeed opinionated in the way of a boy who was just old enough to think he understood things, and not quite old enough to doubt that belief. And he had, within 3 days of her arrival, developed what was transparently an enormous and earnest admiration for Lucy that she handled with the combination of matter-of-factness and kindness that it deserved, never making him feel ridiculous and never giving him an inch. But it was Elijah Winslow who occupied her thinking in ways she had not anticipated and did not entirely welcome. He was not an easy man to know. He was not unfriendly, but he was private in the particular way of someone who had learned, through experience, to keep the inner workings of himself to himself. He spoke when he had something to say and was silent when he didn't, and this was so consistent a quality that it had, over the years she would later learn, given him a reputation in Millhaven as cold or aloof or simply strange. The people of the town had mostly given up trying to draw him out. Lucy did not try to draw him out. She simply went about her work and spoke to him straightforwardly when they were in the same room, asked practical questions about the ranch when they were relevant, and otherwise left him to his own company. Whether it was this approach or something else, she could not say, but she noticed, somewhere in the second week, that he had begun to linger a little longer in the kitchen in the evenings after supper than he strictly needed to, sitting with his coffee and his own thoughts while she cleaned up, and that the silences between them had taken on a different quality. They were not uncomfortable. They were, in fact, very comfortable, which was the thing that she found troubling when she turned it over in her mind late at night in her room with the window open to let in the creek-cooled air. The first real conversation they had, the kind where something actual was said, happened about 3 weeks after her arrival, on a Sunday evening when the ranch hands had gone into Millhaven and the property was quiet. She had brought her mending out to the porch because the light was better, and he had come out, apparently for no reason other than that there was nowhere else he particularly needed to be, and sat in the other chair. For a while, neither of them spoke. "You've been at a ranch before," he said eventually. It was not quite a question. "My parents had a farm," she said, "outside Houston, not cattle, mostly crops, but the principle is the same. Things have to be done at certain times whether or not you feel like doing them." He was quiet for a moment. "What happened to the farm?" "Drought," she said, "and some bad decisions on my father's part, though I try not to fault him for those. He was doing what he thought was best, and it wasn't enough, and that happens." "And your parents?" "Both gone," she said, with the directness she used for things that were true and painful and nonetheless had to be said. "My mother first, then my father. I've been on my own for about 3 years." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That's a long time." "It is," she agreed. "Though it has its advantages. I make my own decisions." "Do the decisions generally work out?" She looked at him. "Some of them," she said. "I'm here, aren't I?" He met her eyes for a moment, and then he looked out at the darkening land, and she thought she saw for just a moment the ghost of that almost smile. "You are," he said. She learned more about him in pieces. The way you learn the layout of a house you've moved into, not all at once, but as you open doors and find rooms you didn't know were there. She learned from Diego, who was more forthcoming than Elijah himself, that the ranch had been Elijah's father's, that the elder Winslow had died 5 years ago, and that Elijah had been running it alone since. She learned from Hector that before coming to the Rocking W, Elijah had spent several years further west, cattle driving and doing various other work of the kind that took a man through a great many places without letting him stay anywhere long. She learned from a woman in Millhaven, a Mrs. Garrett, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store and had an inexhaustible supply of local history, that there had once been a woman, a girl from a family in Abilene who had come to visit relatives in Millhaven, and whom Elijah had courted in the brief, serious way of a man who doesn't do things lightly. The engagement, such as it had been, had ended when the girl went back to Abilene and written to say she had changed her mind. This had been 4 years ago, Mrs. Garrett said, with the satisfied gravity of someone delivering important context, and Elijah Winslow had not shown the slightest interest in anyone since. Lucy absorbed this information with the careful neutrality she applied to information that had more personal relevance than she was prepared to acknowledge, and filed it away. She went to Millhaven for supplies twice a month on the buckboard. She became, in the incremental way of someone who shows up consistently and is competent and honest, a recognized figure in the town. She traded pleasantries with Mrs. Garrett, discussed the quality of the most recent flour delivery with the miller, and made a genuine friend in a woman named Rosa Acosta, who was married to the town's blacksmith and had 3 children and a laughing directness that Lucy found immediately restoring. Rosa was 30 years old and had been in Millhaven since her marriage 8 years prior, and she had the particular combination of warmth and clear-eyedness that Lucy associated with women who had built something real and knew the cost of it. "What's he like?" Rosa asked her, about a month in, as they sat on the step outside the blacksmith's shop while Rosa's eldest child, a boy of 7 named Miguel, chased chickens in the dust. "Elijah Winslow. Everyone says he's impossible, but I've always thought they just don't know how to talk to him. He's quiet," Lucy said, "and he's fair," she said. "He doesn't ask me to do things that are unreasonable, and he thanks me for meals, which some men in his position would consider beneath them. He works as hard as any of his hands, harder probably. He knows every inch of that ranch." Rosa watched her with the knowing expression that was one of her most frequent expressions. "You like him." "I respect him," Lucy said carefully. "That's not the same thing." "No," Rosa agreed, "but it's a start." Lucy looked out at Miguel and the chickens and did not say anything else about it. The thing she had not anticipated was how much she would come to understand the ranch itself, and through it, Elijah. The Rocking W was not just a business to him. It was the thing that organized his life around some central point that she gradually came to recognize as grief. Grief for his father, whom he had clearly loved in the complicated way of 2 men who had worked the same land. Grief for the time before, for whatever he had hoped his life might become before it became what it was. He was not a bitter man, she was clear on that. But he was a man for whom too much had happened and then not very much at all, and the quiet of the ranch had become at once a sanctuary and a kind of slow forgetting. She noticed this because it was something she recognized. She had her own version of it. 6 weeks after her arrival, the ranch had a crisis that, in the manner of ranch crises, arrived without any warning and demanded immediate competent response. The creek that ran along the back of the property flooded after 3 days of heavy late summer rain, taking out a stretch of fence on the south pasture and causing a group of cattle to scatter further than they should have been able to. Elijah and all 4 of the hands rode out in the early morning gray to deal with it, and Lucy, without being asked, organized the practical things that needed organizing at the house end. She had hot food ready at every hour they might come back, made sure there was dry wood inside, patched a barn roof leak with materials she found in the outbuilding without troubling anyone about it, and went out herself, against what she privately acknowledged was better judgment, to help Diego get the 2 horses that had panicked in the night back into the corral. She was returning from this last task, wet through from the rain and leading the calmer of the 2 horses by its rope, when Elijah came back across the yard at a trot and pulled up at the sight of her. He looked at her, at the horse, at the state of her clothes. "What are you doing?" he said. "The horses got out," she said. "Diego needed help. You could have waited for one of the men." "The horses couldn't," she said reasonably, and led the animal past him to the corral gate. He was quiet for a moment, watching her secure the gate. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, "just wet." He dismounted and walked his horse alongside her toward the barn, and they were quiet for a moment, close together in the rain that had settled into a steady, persistent drizzle. She could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder without quite touching. "Thank you," he said, "for everything today, the food, the barn roof." She looked at him. The rain was running off the brim of his hat. "It's my job," she said. "Some of it," he said, "wasn't." There was something in the way he said it that was different from anything he'd said before, something that got underneath the practical tone and sat there in a way she couldn't dismiss. She was aware, with the sudden sharpness of someone who hadn't expected to be aware, of how close they were standing, of the specific quality of the way he was looking at her, direct and serious, and something else that she put careful distance around in her mind. "I'd better go dry off," she said. "Yes," he said. "Go." But neither of them moved for a moment, and the rain came down and the horses shifted in the barn behind them, and then she went. In October, a man named Carl Briggs rode out to the Rocking W. He was a cattle buyer from Dallas, or so he said, and he arrived with a confidence that Lucy recognized immediately as the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted through the sheer weight of his own certainty. He was about 45, well-dressed in the way of a town man trying to pass as a working one, with a pocket watch he consulted with unnecessary frequency, and a way of speaking to Lucy, when she brought coffee to the sitting room where he and Elijah were meeting, that made her feel precisely as though she were furniture. She set the coffee down, went to the kitchen, and had a very private and very thorough opinion about Carl Briggs that she did not share with anyone. She heard enough of the conversation, in the way that one inevitably hears conversations in a house when the walls are what they are, to understand that Briggs was making an offer on a portion of the Rocking W's land, the south section that ran along the creek, which he proposed to purchase in order to redirect water rights to a new cattle concern he was developing. The price he was offering was not insulting, but was significantly below what the land was worth, which she knew because she had made it her business, in the quiet, systematic way she had made many things her business, to understand the basic economics of the ranch she was running the house for. She also knew, because she had been paying attention, that the south pasture was the best watered section of the Rocking W's land, and that losing the water rights associated with it would put the ranch at a significant disadvantage in dry years. She did not say anything about this until after Briggs had gone, and she brought it up then with the careful neutrality of someone offering information rather than opinion. "Forgive me," she said when Elijah came back into the kitchen, "and tell me if I'm overstepping, but that land runs the southern water for the whole property in a dry summer. If you sold the water rights along with it—" "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I told him I'd think about it," he said. "I'm not going to sell." She relaxed slightly. "I'm glad," she said, and then, because she had asked to be forgiven for overstepping and he had not given her permission to proceed, she went back to what she had been doing. But he had paused at the kitchen door. "How do you know the water figures for the south section?" "I asked Diego," she said. "When I first came, I asked him to walk me around the property so I understood what I was managing the house for." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people in your position wouldn't think to do that," he said. "Most people in my position haven't had to keep a farm alive in a drought," she said. He stood there for a moment longer, looking at her in that way he had that she was becoming increasingly unable to look at with complete equanimity. "Lucy," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. The 2 or 3 previous times she had noted him stopping himself, correcting back to Miss Langley with the formality he seemed to have decided was appropriate. She looked up at him. "Thank you," he said, "for paying attention." She looked back down at the counter. "You're welcome, Mr. Winslow." She heard the faint exhale that might have been a laugh, and then his footsteps going down the hall. November came, bringing cold nights and the particular quality of autumn light that made the landscape look like something painted. Lucy had made the house genuinely comfortable in ways that went beyond her original mandate, small things that she'd done as much for her own need for a home as for any professional reason. Curtains in the kitchen windows that let in light while blocking the worst of the winter draft. A braided rug in the sitting room where the bare boards had always looked cold. Dried herbs from the kitchen garden she'd put in along the south wall of the house in September, hanging now from the kitchen ceiling and scenting the room with something warm and alive. Elijah noticed these things. He did not mention them except once, when he stood in the kitchen doorway in the early morning and looked at the curtains and the herbs and the organized warmth of the room, and said simply, "This is the nicest this kitchen has looked since my mother was alive." She did not know what to say to that, so she handed him his coffee and he took it, and that was all that was said. She rode into Millhaven on the first Saturday of November to pick up supplies, and Rosa, who was waiting for her because they had made a habit of having lunch together on Lucy's supply days, looked at her with the close attention of a friend who has been observing and drawing conclusions. "You're different," Rosa said, over plates of beans and tortillas at the small table Rosa set up at the back of the blacksmith shop on days her husband was working and she needed company. "I'm not different," Lucy said. "Your face is different," Rosa said. "You have this particular look that people get when they're trying very hard not to think about something." "I don't know what you mean," Lucy said. "Lucy." Rosa. Rosa ate a bite of her food and regarded her friend with the comfortable persistence of someone who had all afternoon. "He's a good man," Rosa said eventually. "He's my employer," Lucy said. "The two things are not mutually exclusive." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "It's not practical," she said. "Most things that matter aren't," Rosa said. Lucy thought about that for the rest of the day, which was irritating and also honest, which was more irritating still. The thing that changed it, or began to change it, happened on a cold evening in the middle of November when a late storm had brought a sharp freeze and Elijah had come in from a long day checking on the outer pasture cattle, cold in a way that went beyond the physical. She could see it in the way he sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around the coffee she had given him, not quite present in the room. She finished what she was doing at the counter and then, because it was the thing to do and because she trusted herself to do it with the right amount of care, she sat down across from him. He looked up. He was not a man who expected company in his silences, she knew that, and she watched for whether her being there was welcome or not. He did not look away. "Bad day?" she asked. "Lost 2 cows," he said. "The freeze got them before we found them. Should have checked further north yesterday." "You can't be everywhere," she said. "I know this land," he said, with the particular flat severity of someone who was holding themselves responsible. "I should have known to check further north." She looked at him steadily. "You run a cattle operation, not a crystal ball," she said. "You did what you could with what you knew." He was quiet. "Is this the first time you've lost animals to a freeze?" she asked. "No. And the last time did you blame yourself the same way?" A brief pause. "Probably." "And did the ranch survive?" He looked at her. "Yes." "Then," she said, "I expect it will again." Something in him, some tight quality she had not entirely noticed until it began to relax, settled slightly. He looked at her with that direct, serious gaze, and she held it this time, did not look away, and the kitchen was warm and the storm was outside and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "Someone more interested in telling me what I wanted to hear." "That's never been a particular skill of mine," she said. "No," he agreed, and this time she was certain, absolutely certain, that the expression that moved across his face was a smile, small and real and nothing like the social variety. "No, it's not." She went to bed that night with her thoughts in a state of gentle disorder that she recognized as problematic, and also, she could not deny, very pleasant. On a Saturday afternoon in late November, the town of Millhaven put on its annual early winter gathering, a modest affair by the standards of larger towns, but significant to the people who attended it. With tables set up in the open ground between the general store and the saloon, food brought by every household in the area, a fiddle player and a guitar player who were brothers, and played with the kind of unrehearsed enthusiasm that was more infectious than technical precision would have been. People came from the surrounding ranches and farms, and it was understood to be the occasion when anyone who had been keeping to themselves through the hard-working months of summer and fall came back into community with their neighbors. Elijah went, which surprised her, and then she realized it probably shouldn't have, because he was a man who took his obligations seriously, and showing up when the community gathered was an obligation of a kind. He had asked her, with the careful formality he used for social questions, whether she would care to come along, and she had said yes, which had been perhaps too quickly, but there it was. She wore her better dress, a deep green cotton that she had made herself and that was plain but well cut, and she put her hair up properly, and when she came out to the buckboard where he was already waiting with the horses, she saw him look at her with a brief, entirely genuine attention before he looked away again and offered her a hand up. Rosa was there with her husband, Fernando, a wide-shouldered, cheerful man with a gift for appearing wherever the most interesting conversation was happening. The ranch hands came in from the bunkhouse where they had apparently engaged in competitive getting ready, because Billy and Pete had clearly spent time on their hair, and Tom was wearing a new shirt that still had the fold creases in it. Even Hector had put on his good hat. There was food and talk and children running between the adults' legs, and the Fiddle brothers struck up a reel that pulled people into a rough approximation of dancing in the dust. Lucy ate and talked and felt the specific pleasure of being genuinely part of something, a feeling she had not allowed herself often. At some point in the evening, she looked across the gathering and found Elijah standing at the edge of it, slightly separate in the way he tended to be in groups, watching the dancing. He had a cup in his hand, and he was standing with a particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand was not disengagement but something more like a man watching the world from just outside the warmth of it. She went to stand beside him. "You should dance," she said. "I don't dance," he said. "Everyone dances," she said. "Some people just do it badly." He looked at her. "What category do you fall into?" "Enthusiastically," she said, "which covers a great many technical deficiencies." He looked at the dancers for a moment. Then he looked at her. Then, with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him, a man who did not do things without deciding to do them, he offered her his hand. She took it. He was not, as it turned out, a bad dancer. He was controlled and formal and slightly too careful, but he kept time and he was steady, and he held her with the firm, light certainty of a man who, if he was going to do a thing, was going to do it properly. She danced with the wholehearted willingness. She had promised and felt the smile come onto her face without any particular decision to put it there. And she looked up at him, and he was looking down at her with that expression that she had been carefully not naming. And for the duration of that one reel in the November dust, with the fiddles going and the firelight flickering and the whole small, warm gathering of Millhaven around them, something between them shifted into something new. They did not speak of it. They drove back to the ranch in the dark, side by side on the buckboard, and the silence had the particular quality of something acknowledged without words, and Lucy looked at the stars and told herself very firmly to be careful. The problem, she thought, in the days that followed, was not that she had feelings she shouldn't have. The problem was that she was not certain the feelings were unwise. She was not a girl. She was 24 years old and had been managing her own life for 3 years and was clear-eyed about the ways things could go wrong. She was employed by this man, which was a practical complication. She had no family here, no safety net, and her independence, fragile as it was the only security she had ever been able to fully rely on. And there was, underneath all of that practical inventory, a quieter fear, the kind that did not show itself in daylight but kept her company in the dark. She had watched her mother love her father with absolute devotion, and then grieve him in a way that had taken something from her that never came back. She had watched people hold on to things with both hands and then have those things taken. She knew, with the bone-deep knowledge of someone who had had things taken, how much it cost. She went on with her work. She was good at that. But Elijah had noticed something. She could feel it. He watched her with a new attentiveness that he seemed no better at concealing than she was at ignoring, and there were moments, in the kitchen in the mornings or over supper or in the evenings on the porch, when the air between them had a charged quality that she thought neither of them quite knew what to do with. It was Diego who said something, because Diego, it turned out, was a man of acute perceptiveness who had been at the Rocking W for 11 years and had very clear feelings about Elijah Winslow's long-standing solitude. He said it to Lucy one afternoon when she was hanging washing and he was mending tack in the yard nearby, in the easy conversational way of two people who had been working in the same space long enough not to need to engineer a moment. "He laughs more since you came," Diego said, without looking up from the harness he was working on. Lucy looked at him. "He barely laughs at all." "That's what I mean," Diego said. "More than before is still more." She went back to the washing. "He is a good man," Diego said. I have worked for him for 11 years, and I would not say that if it was not true. I know he's a good man, she said. Knowing and allowing are different things, Diego said, with the philosophical brevity of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly. Lucy pinned a shirt to the line with more force than was strictly necessary and said nothing. It came to the point, as things that have been building always do, on a cold December evening when the year was almost done and the nights were long and the ranch was quiet. She was in the kitchen by lamplight when Elijah came in from checking the stock, later than usual, and stood in the doorway with frost on his shoulders and an expression she hadn't seen before, something that was not quite hesitation but was adjacent to it. "There's something I want to say," he said. She set down what she was holding and looked at him. He came in and sat at the table, though he did not take off his hat, which told her he had not yet decided this was a conversation he was fully committed to. She sat across from him. "I don't know how to do this particularly well," he said. "I'm better at managing cattle than managing conversations of this type." "I've noticed you manage cattle quite successfully," she said. He looked at her with that almost smile, and for a moment the tension in him eased. "The cattle don't argue back," he said. "I will definitely argue back," she said. "I know," he said. "I was counting on it." She was quiet, watching him. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. "I've been thinking," he said, "for a while now, about asking if you would want to walk with me, on Sundays when you have time. Nothing that changes your position here if you'd rather it didn't change." He was being very careful, she noticed, to give her an exit. "I just want to know you better than the kitchen lets me." She sat with that for a moment. "You already know me fairly well," she said. "For someone who knows me through the kitchen." "Not well enough," he said quietly. She looked at him, at the angular weathered face and the steady coffee-dark eyes that were watching her with an honesty she found almost hard to bear. "All right," she said. "Sundays." He exhaled, something she suspected he had not entirely realized he'd been holding. "All right," he said, and so on Sundays they walked. They walked out to the creek, and along it through the cottonwoods that were bare-branched and beautiful in the winter light. And they walked out to the north pasture, where the grass lay yellow and stiff with frost, and the sky went on forever in that specific vast way of Texas winter. They talked, or they were quiet, and both were equally comfortable, which Lucy had decided was one of the more reliable indicators that a person was worth your time. She learned, on those Sundays, things about him that the kitchen and the practical business of the ranch had not given her. She learned that he had been 17 when he'd first worked a cattle drive, as a water boy initially and then in a more legitimate capacity, and that he had spent the following 6 years covering enormous distances across Texas and Kansas and parts of New Mexico, not because he was running from anything exactly, but because staying put had not yet seemed like the right choice. She learned that he had read everything he could get his hands on since he was a child, that there were 3 crates of books in the study that he'd accumulated over the years, that he had an opinion about every one of them, and was unexpectedly and seriously good at the kind of conversation that books generate. She learned that his father had been a man of few words who had nonetheless expressed love in the completely legible language of action, who had worked the ranch for 30 years with absolute commitment, and who had told Elijah, the last winter before he died, that the only thing he regretted was that the place would go to one person alone instead of a family. She learned that Elijah had carried this with him in the way people carry the things that are said to them when they are young and vulnerable, and someone they love speaks plainly. She told him things in return, because he asked in a way that made her feel that her answers mattered, which was rarer in her experience than it should have been. She told him about her mother, a woman of extraordinary practical intelligence and a dry sense of humor, who had made something out of very little and had never once complained about it publicly. She told him about the farm and the drought and the specific texture of watching something you've worked for come apart, and he listened in the way of someone who understood the weight of what she was saying, not filling the space with reassurance but simply being present with it. She told him, one Sunday when the creek was half frozen, and they were standing still for a moment watching a hawk ride the cold air overhead, that she had never in her adult life felt certain she would stay anywhere. He was quiet for a moment. "What would it take?" he asked. She looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. January arrived new and cold and clear. Elijah asked her one evening if she had looked at the books lately, meaning the ranch's account books which he kept in the study and which she had no business looking at, professionally speaking, though she had noticed him leave them on the kitchen table more than once with what she had decided was deliberateness rather than carelessness. "I haven't looked at your account books," she said. "Would you?" he asked. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I trust your thinking," he said simply. She looked at the books. She was good with numbers, had always been. It was one of the practical skills her mother had insisted on teaching her. Because, her mother had said, the world is run by people who can count, and you'd better be able to count too. She spent an evening with the books and came to him the next morning with 2 or 3 things she had noticed that she thought were worth discussing. A supplier in Dallas who was charging more than the going rate for feed. A cattle sale she thought could be timed better given what she'd observed about market prices when she went into Millhaven. And a small but recurring expense she thought could be reduced by one of Diego's suggestions that had been mentioned in passing and apparently not acted on. He listened to all of it with complete attention, asked several good questions, and implemented all 3 suggestions within the month. "You're wasted in the kitchen," he said, one afternoon not long after. "The kitchen is not a waste," she said. "It's the center of the house." "That's not what I meant," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. February came with a cold snap and then a sudden, startling week of warmth that made the air smell like something waking up. On one of those warm afternoons, on their Sunday walk, they had come to the place along the creek where there were 2 old cottonwoods whose branches had grown together overhead, and they stopped there as they often did because the light through the bare interlocked branches was remarkable, and Elijah said without any preamble, "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead," she said. He turned to look at her with the directness that was one of the things she valued most in him. "Do you think you want to stay here?" he asked. "Here at the ranch, not in the position, not as a paid arrangement, here." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very large question," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it since about 3 weeks after you arrived, which I know sounds unreasonable." "It doesn't sound unreasonable," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. "I know I'm not easy company," he said. "I know this place is not. I know it's isolated and the work is hard and I'm better with cattle than with people and you deserve—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm trying to say that I know you have your own life and your own mind and that you're not looking for someone to take care of you, which is one of the things He stopped again. "Elijah," she said. He looked at her. "I know all of that about you," she said. "I've been watching you for 5 months. I know you're better with cattle than with parties. I know the ranch is isolated. I know what I'd be choosing." "Is that a yes?" he said, and there was something in the directness of it that was so purely him that she wanted to laugh. "It's not a no," she said. "I just need you to understand something first." "All right." She looked at him carefully because this was the thing she needed to say and she needed to say it straight. "You'll get tired of me," she said. "Eventually. I am opinionated and I argue and I will look at your account books without being asked, and I will rearrange your kitchen and I will tell you when I think you're wrong. I'm not easy either. And I don't know how to be less than I am to make things simpler." He looked at her steadily throughout this. "Are you finished?" he asked. "No," she said. I don't have anything. No family, no land, no money beyond my wages, nothing to bring except myself. And I know that isn't Lucy," he said. She stopped. "I have been tired," he said quietly, "of nearly everything else in my life for years. The work I love, but I've been doing it alone for a long time, and the doing alone has become a kind of tiredness I didn't know how to name until you came. I've been tired of the quiet in the evenings and the sitting on that porch by myself. I've been tired of it in a way that I'd stopped expecting to change." He paused. I haven't been tired of you. Not once in 5 months, not for a single morning or evening or conversation. You could rearrange every room in this house and argue with me every day and I would still—" He stopped and looked out at the creek for a moment, and she could see him choosing words with the care of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. "I would still very much want you here." She looked at him for a long time. "You'll get tired of me," she said again, more quietly this time, almost to herself. "I've been tired of everything else for years," he said. "I think you're the only thing I haven't been tired of since I was 20 years old and thought life was going to be everything at once." She felt something in her chest do something complicated, something she had been guarding against for months, and she let it. "All right," she said. "All right, you'll stay?" he asked. "All right, I'll stay," she said. "And you should know you can't take it back." "I don't want to take it back," he said, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his, the way she had seen him hold his coffee cup in the cold, with a certainty and a warmth that was entirely unconscious, and she let herself lean into it. They stood there by the frozen creek under the interlocked cottonwoods, and neither of them said anything more for a while, because nothing more needed to be said. That evening, when they returned to the ranch, Diego looked at them from across the yard with the expression of a man who had been patiently waiting for this particular outcome and found its arrival satisfactory. He said nothing. He went back to what he was doing, but she saw the way his mustache moved. Tom, the youngest ranch hand, noticed also, with the terrible radar of an 18-year-old, and appeared to be briefly shattered before recovering with impressive speed, and announcing at supper that he was glad Miss Langley was going to be around because her biscuits were the best he'd ever had, which was, everyone agreed, a graceful response to a difficult moment. They were married in March, on a day of pale spring sunlight and a wind that smelled like new grass. The ceremony was held in Millhaven's small white church, performed by Reverend Atkins, who was a thin, gentle man with a perpetual cold, and a gift for saying the right words without too many of them. Rosa and Fernando Acosta were there, Rosa in a yellow dress that she'd made for the occasion, Fernando with his good hat and an expression of genuine pleasure. Diego sat in the front row looking profoundly uncomfortable in his dress clothes and profoundly pleased about the whole business. The ranch hands sat in a row, Billy and Pete making something of a ceremony of it, and Tom sitting very straight with a new dignity he was trying on. Mrs. Garrett was there, needless to say, because she would not have missed it for anything, and she cried in the excellent productive way of someone who has been waiting for a thing to happen and is deeply gratified by its arrival. Elijah wore a dark coat she had never seen him in and clearly had pressed for the occasion, and he stood at the front of the church with the contained, focused calm of a man who had decided to do a thing and was doing it with his whole self. When she came down the aisle, which was short, it was a small church, he looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, something unguarded and sure and wholly himself. The vows were simple and direct, which suited both of them. "Lucy," he said, at the point where he was meant to say them. "Elijah," she said, when it was her turn. Reverend Atkins, who was a perceptive man, had not made the vows complicated. The essential things were clear. Afterward, there was a celebration at the Acosta house, because Rosa had organized it, and Rosa organized things with thoroughness and warmth in equal measure. And there was food and the Fiddle Brothers, and the particular quality of happiness that comes from a community choosing to be genuinely glad for two of its members. Elijah danced with her twice, which was significant, and with Rosa once, which Rosa accepted with the gracious triumph of a woman who had helped bring something about and felt entitled to a small acknowledgement. They drove back to the ranch in the evening light, the two of them on the buckboard, the horses knowing the road, and the sky going orange and then pink and then the deep purple that preceded the stars. She had her hand through his arm and his hand over hers. "Well," she said after a while. "Well," he agreed. "I meant it," she said. "You can't take it back." He turned his head and looked at her in the last light. "I know," he said. "I don't want to." She looked at the road ahead of them. "I'm going to rearrange the sitting room," she said. "I know," he said, "and I'm going to look at the spring cattle plan and I have some thoughts." "I expected that," he said. "And when you're wrong, I'm going to tell you." "Lucy." "Yes, I know," he said, and she could hear the smile in it now, open and real and just for her. "I've been counting on it." Spring came to the rocking W with its particular force, the grass coming up thick and green along the creek and the calving season bringing its combination of exhaustion and fresh life, and the particular satisfaction of things renewing themselves. Elijah was out long hours and Lucy was alongside him more often than not, because she had negotiated, in the calm direct way she negotiated things, an expansion of her role that was acknowledged by both of them to be something different from what she'd been hired for, and was in fact simply the natural expression of being a partner in a working ranch. She was, in fact, gifted at it. Diego said so, which was notable because Diego did not offer praise unless he genuinely meant it. She had a gift for reading the cattle that surprised Elijah, and that she attributed to having grown up around animals, and she had a practicality about the business side of the operation that, combined with her work on the accounts, had already produced measurable improvements in the ranch's finances. She was happy in a way she had not expected to be, which she observed with some wonder from a slight internal distance, the habit of a woman who had not allowed herself to count on things. Elijah was, in the privacy of their life together, different from the man the town thought it knew. He was drier in humor, more genuinely curious, more capable of tenderness than his outward presentation suggested. He was careful with her in ways that mattered, not with the excessive caution of a man afraid to be himself, but with the attentiveness of someone who had decided another person was worth his full regard. He brought her small things, a book from the general store that Mrs. Garrett had said was new, and that he thought she might like, based on a conversation they'd had about a novel she'd mentioned reading in San Antonio. A particular kind of early spring wildflower that grew along the creek in the spot where they'd first held hands, left on the kitchen table with no comment. A day in late spring when she had mentioned, once in passing, that she had always wanted to see the canyon country further west, and he had arranged for them to ride out that direction for 2 days with bedrolls and a packed supper, not saying where they were going until they came up over a ridge, and the land opened up below them in golds and reds, and the particular majesty that the Texas hill country offered to people who bothered to go looking. She had stood at the edge of it and felt the kind of feeling that didn't have a name except joy, and she had looked at him and he was watching her, not the canyon, with an expression that she thought might be the best thing she had ever seen on a human face. "You planned this," she said. "You mentioned it once," he said. "Months ago," she said. "I remembered," he said. She took his hand. They stood there for a very long time. Summer came full and blazing and busy in the way of summers on a working ranch. And in August, in the private accounting she kept of herself, Lucy acknowledged that she was expecting a child. She told Elijah on a Saturday morning, directly in the kitchen, the way she told him most important things, because she had come to understand that he preferred directness to preamble and that hedging made him more anxious, not less. He sat down, which was the only betrayal of how the news landed. He sat down and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly, surprise and something that was clearly working its way toward profound happiness but was passing through a moment of overwhelm to get there. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm healthy and I feel fine and I've been thinking about names." He looked at her. The overwhelm resolved. The happiness arrived clean and complete. "Have you?" he said. "Your father's name was Robert," she said. "It was," he said. "I thought if it was a boy," she said, and then she stopped because he had gotten up from the table and crossed to her and had his hands on her face and was looking at her with something so open and sure that she had to put her hands over his. "Lucy," he said. "Don't you dare cry," she said. "I'm not going to cry," he said roughly. "You were thinking about it," she said. "I was absolutely not," he said, and his voice was slightly not right, and she laughed. And he pulled her close and she put her forehead against his chest, and they stayed like that in the kitchen while the coffee was still hot on the stove, and the summer morning came in through the curtained windows. Diego, when told, said simply that it was good news, and that he would fix the gate on the north fence that had been loose all spring, as though structural readiness was the appropriate response to pending parenthood. Rosa Acosta was considerably more demonstrative, and arrived the following Sunday with 24 things she'd either made or collected, and several very firm opinions about what Lucy needed to be eating. Tom, the ranch hand, went so red in the face when Lucy told the hands at supper that Pete had to tell him to breathe. In the early months, Lucy continued to work at full capacity, because she was well and because she was not constitutionally capable of reducing herself to an invalid status for a natural process, and because Elijah, who had initially approached the subject of her slowing down with the extreme caution of a man who knew he was navigating difficult terrain, had ultimately accepted her assessment that she knew her own body and her own limits, and thereafter contented himself with making sure there was always wood brought in and water drawn before she could do it herself, and positioning himself in the vicinity of any task that required climbing, with an air of nonchalance that was not remotely convincing. She found this endearing in a way that she told Rosa about, and that Rosa found hilarious. In November, as the weather was closing in again and the cottonwood trees along the creek had gone entirely bare, Lucy gave birth to a boy. It was a hard labor, attended by the town's doctor, a capable older man named Dr. Hale, who had been in Millhaven since 1870, and had attended a great many births in his time, and by Rosa, who had strong opinions about how these things should go and stood in the corner through most of it with her jaw set in the specific expression of a woman who has had 3 children herself, and is exercising considerable restraint about not directing the proceedings. Elijah was in the hall. He had initially been in the room, but Lucy had sent him out at the point when his presence had shifted from helpful to anxious, because anxious was not a useful contribution to the situation, and he was sensible enough to understand this, though it was clearly costing him something to wait in the hall without information. The boy arrived in the small hours of the night, healthy and immediate, with a set of lungs whose volume surprised Dr. Hale into a sound of approval. Rosa brought him out to Elijah. The sound that came from the hall was quiet, short, and entirely undone, and Rosa came back into the room with wet eyes and said to Lucy, "You should see his face." And Lucy, who was exhausted and aching and cleaner than she had been 10 minutes before, said, "Bring me my son and bring me my husband." They brought her both. Elijah came and sat at the edge of the bed, and he held the boy with the careful, absolute attention of someone discovering an entirely new category of important, and he looked at Lucy over the small dark head with an expression that said everything there was to say without a word. "Robert," she said. "Robert," he agreed. "He has your nose," she said. "He does not," he said. "He absolutely does," Rosa said from the corner. Robert Winslow grew, as babies do, with astonishing speed, through the winter and into a spring that seemed to Lucy particularly beautiful that year, though she was aware this might be the effect of everything else. He was a good baby, by which the adults around him meant a baby who expressed his needs clearly, and then, when those needs were met, was content to observe the world with the alert curiosity that both his parents recognized. Elijah was a father with the same quality he brought to everything he cared about, attentive and consistent and unhurried, the kind of father who was down on the floor with a baby regardless of who was watching, and who woke for the night feedings without being asked. He was, Lucy observed, visibly transformed by the experience, not in his essential character. He was still the same quiet, precise, intensely competent man he had always been, but in his relationship to the ranch, to the future, to the shape of his own life. The tiredness she had seen in him when she first came, that particular weariness of a man who had been going through the motions without quite knowing why, had been replaced by something that was almost its opposite. She saw it most clearly on a morning when she came through the kitchen door with Robert on her hip to find Elijah already at the table with his coffee, looking out the window at the ranch in the early light, and he turned at her footsteps, and his face did the thing it always did when she came into a room, a thing she had noticed and catalogued for the past 15 months, and that still had the power to move her in ways she had stopped pretending it didn't. "Good morning," he said. "He kept me up until 3, she said, sitting down and transferring Robert to his outstretched arms without ceremony. "I know," he said. "I heard I was going to get up." "You were asleep," she said. "I was pretending to be asleep," he said, "to see if you'd let me help." She looked at him. "That is an exceptionally poor strategy." "I know," he said. "I'm going to retire it." He settled Robert against his chest, and the baby immediately grabbed a fistful of his shirt with the fierce conviction of a small person who has found something worth holding. Elijah looked down at him with that expression, the unguarded one, and then back up at Lucy. "I've been thinking," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The east section," he said, "the 20 acres along the tree line. I want to put the house there eventually, not now but eventually. Better water than the main house, more protected from the north wind in winter, and the view is—" He paused. "The view is better." She looked at him for a moment. "That's where we went the first winter," she said. "That Sunday." "Yes," he said. "The day you held my hand," she said. "Yes," he said, and she could see the quiet pleasure in the acknowledgement of it. "I've always thought that was the best part of the property." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "It's a very good plan," she said. "I thought you'd have opinions about it," he said. "I have several," she said. "The house should face southeast, and there should be a proper porch all the way around, not just in front." "Obviously," he said. "And a bigger kitchen," she said. "Than the one you've already rearranged twice," he said. "It's an improvement opportunity," she said, and he laughed, open and easy, the laugh she had cultivated from that barely there almost smile over the better part of a year, the laugh that was entirely hers. The summer of 1884 brought two things of significance to the rocking W. The first was a letter from Carl Briggs, the cattle buyer who had come out 2 years before trying to purchase the south section. The letter was from a lawyer in Dallas, polished and indirect in the way of legal letters, suggesting that Mr. Briggs's interests and Mr. Winslow's might be better served by a revised discussion of the matter. Elijah read it at the kitchen table and handed it to Lucy, who read it twice and set it back down. "He's offering more now," she said. "More still isn't enough," Elijah said, "and I don't trust him any better." "Agreed," she said. "Write back through your own lawyer. Make it clear you're not interested in any configuration of this sale." She paused. "Make sure your water rights documentation is all properly filed with the county." He looked at her with the expression that was by now her particular favorite, a combination of appreciation and the specific pleasure of a man who knew that having someone argue back at him was, in fact, one of the things he valued most about his life. "Already done," he said. "Last month." "You anticipated him," she said. "I had a feeling," he said. "And you said something last fall about getting ahead of it." She had, in fact, said that, during one of their evening conversations, almost in passing, and he had listened and acted on it and not made a ceremony of telling her so. She found this, as she found many things about him, deeply satisfying. The second thing was that she knew by August that she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others, which was, Dr. Hale told her, often how the second one went, the body having the knowledge but not always the patience. She was well throughout and continued to run the house and the account books and more of the ranch's management logistics, with the focused energy of a woman who had found the right scale for her abilities and was using all of them. Rosa came to stay for the last 2 weeks, having arranged her own household with the thoroughness of someone who had done this before, and the two of them spent those 2 weeks in the easy, companionable rhythm of women who know each other well, talking about everything and nothing and laughing a great deal, and sitting in the evening on the porch with the cooling air and the stars, and a comfort that Lucy thought was one of the finest things her life in Millhaven had produced. In April of 1885, she gave birth to a girl. The birth was faster than Robert's, and the girl arrived with the specific alert intensity that, as she grew, would turn out to be the most characteristic thing about her. They named her Clara, after Lucy's mother, which had been Elijah's suggestion, made in the direct way he made suggestions that mattered simply. "I'd like her to be Clara if you're willing. You've never stopped talking about your mother and she should have a name in the house." Lucy had not been able to immediately respond, which was unusual for her, and he had simply waited with the patience he had in these moments, and she had eventually said yes, and it was settled. Clara Winslow was a luminous, curious, highly opinionated child, who at 6 months of age was already conducting thorough examinations of everything within reach, and who at 12 months walked early and purposefully, as though she had somewhere to be. Robert, who was 2.5 and had been the center of the universe for all of it, was initially uncertain about this new presence, and then, quite suddenly, was not, and became the elder brother with a seriousness of purpose that was so clearly derived from his father that Diego watched it happening with open satisfaction. The house on the east section was begun in the spring of 1885, when the ranch was in good enough financial health to undertake the construction, which Lucy had determined through the accounts, and a detailed plan she had presented to Elijah over the course of several evenings at the kitchen table, with the maps she'd drawn herself, and the estimates she'd gotten from the builder in Millhaven. Elijah had listened to all of it and asked the right questions and agreed to the plan in its essential shape, while proposing 2 modifications, one of which was correct, and one of which she had argued him out of correctly. The builder was a man named Sorensen, a Norwegian who had been in Texas for 20 years and had a craftsman's precision and a patience with the particular demands of ranch house construction in the hill country. He built the house over the spring and summer, with a crew of 4 including his son, who was 15 and learning the trade, and Diego, who had decided that overseeing the construction was part of his job description, and who was, in fact, invaluable. The house took shape through the warm months, facing southeast as Lucy had specified, with the porch running all the way around as she had specified, and with a kitchen that was considerably larger than the one in the old house, and with a room for each of the children and one more, because, as Elijah had said without further explanation, that seemed right. They moved into it in September of 1885, when the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to turn gold, and the morning air had the first trace of autumn in it. The old ranch house became the bunkhouse, which the hands felt was a significant improvement in their accommodations, and said so with a warmth that made Lucy laugh. The first evening in the new house, after the children were asleep and the boxes were not yet entirely unpacked, and the room still had the particular quality of newness, they sat on the porch together in the dark, the way they had sat on porches together for the past 3 years, and the land was spread out before them under a sky full of stars, and the creek was somewhere below them in the dark, and the cottonwoods rustled, and Elijah had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder. "This is what he meant," he said after a while. "Your father," she said. "He said it was better with a family," he said. "I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just he was quiet for a moment. I thought he was talking about having people around, company. I didn't know he meant the feeling of it being yours, both yours, not just." He stopped. She lifted her head and looked at him in the dark. "The feeling of it being worth it," she said. "Yes," he said. She settled back against him. "I warned you," she said after a moment. He made a sound of amusement against her hair. "You did." "You haven't gotten tired of me," she observed. "I mentioned that I wouldn't," he said. "You were very confident for someone who'd known me 6 months." "I was confident for someone who knew what he'd been missing," he said quietly. She was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth of him beside her and the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was hers now, not in the precarious way of things rented or borrowed or held under sufferance, but in the absolute way of things that belonged to a life she had built alongside someone who understood exactly who she was and had decided, with the deliberate certainty that characterized everything he did, that this was the precise thing he wanted. "I spent a long time," she said, "not staying anywhere because nothing was worth staying for." "I know," he said. "I was wrong about this place," she said. "You weren't wrong," he said. "You just hadn't been here yet." She turned her head and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and in the starlight he was so familiar and so completely hers that she felt it with a fullness she had no words for and didn't need. "This is the right place," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to need the larger kitchen organized differently than we discussed," she said. He laughed. Really laughed, the way he laughed when something delighted him, and pulled her closer, and she let herself be pulled. And the stars were extraordinary, and the creek was running down below, and the cottonwoods were sighing in the dark. And she thought about her father's advice, about taking what you needed from a world that owed you nothing, and thought that her father had been right about the world owing nothing, but wrong about the taking, because the best things she had were not taken. They were chosen. And she had chosen them with her eyes open and her whole self present, and they had been chosen back with the same completeness, and she thought that was, in the end, the only thing that lasted. The years settled around the rocking W like layers of good earth, each one adding something to the depth of it. In 1887, the extra room became occupied, as Elijah had apparently foreseen it would, by a second son they named Daniel. He arrived in winter, like his father's temperament, quiet and self-contained and steady, though he had his mother's green eyes and her habit of watching things with an attention that occasionally unnerved people who were used to children looking through rather than at them. Tom, the ranch hand, had by this time left the rocking W to start his own small operation in the next county, which he did with the ambition and confidence of a young man who had learned from watching competent people work and had decided he could do the same. He came back to visit twice a year, and Lucy made sure he was fed properly both times, and Elijah gave him advice with the brisk generosity of someone who had been given good advice at the right moment and understood its value. Billy and Pete were still there, older now, settled into the ranch the way that permanent hands settled, the place having become the thing that organized their lives. Hector had gone home to New Mexico to tend to an ailing brother, and had sent a letter the following spring saying he had decided to stay, which everyone had understood and accepted. His replacement was a young man of 20 named Carlos, who was Diego's nephew and who had Diego's quality of missing very little. Diego himself was aging in the way of wiry, vigorous men who seemed to be running ahead of time, still first in the yard most mornings, still capable of more physical work than men 20 years his junior, still managing the horses with a wordless mastery that Elijah observed with consistent admiration. Lucy had, over the years, developed with Diego the relationship of two people who have understood each other from the beginning, and found that understanding to be, without drama, one of the most reliable things in their lives. He was present at all 3 of the children's births, waiting in the yard with the same patient stillness, and at each one he had come in afterward, looked at the baby, said something brief and entirely true, and gone back to his work. When Daniel was born, he had looked at the baby for a long moment and said, "3 is a good number," and then looked at Lucy with the expression that was his version of deep feeling, and she had said, "It is," and they had understood each other completely. On a spring evening in 1888, when Robert was 5 and Clara was 3 and Daniel was 14 months, and the rocking W was in the best financial health it had ever been, Lucy was sitting on the porch after the children were in bed with the account books on her lap, though she was not really looking at them. The evening was warm and the cottonwoods were in full pale green leaf, and the creek was audible below, and the last light was doing extraordinary things to the sky. Elijah came out and sat beside her. He looked at the account books in her lap and the fact that she was not looking at them. "You're not working," he said. "I'm thinking," she said, "about the accounts." "About everything," she said. "About how this happened." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. "You arrived with a broken wagon wheel," he said. "You fixed it," she said. "You would have found someone else to fix it," he said. "I would have," she agreed. "I was resourceful." "You still are," he said. "Exhaustingly so." "I warned you," she said. "You warned me a great many times," he said, with that ease in his voice that she associated with him being entirely himself, entirely comfortable, entirely present. "I was never listening to the warning. I was always listening to you." She looked at him. He was looking out at the land, the familiar angular profile, the dark hair that had threads of gray at the temples now that he seemed entirely unaware of and that she found, though she had not told him this, unreasonably appealing. He was 6 years older than she was, and they had been together for 6 years, and he was, she thought, better looking to her now than he had been the day she'd arrived. Not in spite of those 6 years, but because of them, because she knew every expression and every quality and every corner of the person behind the face, and the knowing was the thing. "I love you," she said. He turned and looked at her with something simple and complete. "I know," he said. "I've been counting on it." "For how long?" she asked. He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to sincere questions. "Since about the 3rd week," he said. "When you fixed the barn roof in the rain without telling anyone and came back leading a horse that had twice your body weight and you were completely soaked and you were not complaining." "I never complain," she said. "You advocate vigorously," he said. "It's different." She laughed. He watched her laugh with the expression that was, she knew by now, the one reserved entirely for her. "I love you," he said. "If we're saying it out loud this evening." "We're saying it out loud this evening," she confirmed. He reached over and took the account books from her lap and set them aside and took her hand in both of his. The way he had that first time along the frozen creek, with the absolute certainty of someone who had chosen this and would choose it again without hesitation. The stars were coming out over the hill country, one and then several and then the whole scattered glory of them. The way they came out over West Texas with a profligacy that felt like generosity, like the sky offering its best. The cottonwoods moved in a warm current of air. Down the hill in the bunkhouse, someone had a mouth organ going, something slow and simple and sweet. Lucy looked up at the stars, and then at the land that was hers, and at the man beside her who had said, with the calm and absolute conviction of someone who knew his own mind, that he had been tired of everything else for years and he was not tired of her, had never been tired of her. And she thought that this specific warmth and this specific place and this specific hand holding hers in the long spring dark, was the thing she had been riding toward when she came into Millhaven with a broken wheel and 17 cents and the kind of courage that comes from having nothing to lose. She had been wrong about that last part, as it turned out. She had quite a great deal to lose now. She intended to hold on to every bit of it. The spring moved into summer, and summer into fall, and the rocking W went on doing what working ranches do, sustaining itself and the people on it, asking everything from them and giving everything back. Robert started at the Millhaven School in the fall of 1888, walking with his father to the buckboard each morning with the seriousness of a child who understood that this was an important undertaking and intended to do it correctly. He had Elijah's exactness and Lucy's relentless curiosity, which his teacher, a young woman named Miss Parsons who had come from Arkansas and was still adjusting to Texas, reported was both extraordinary and occasionally exhausting. Clara, 2 years behind him, was preparing herself for school with an intensity that suggested she viewed it as an anticipated conquest rather than a transition, and had already conducted an independent survey of every book in her father's study, asking for explanations of the ones she couldn't read yet with a persistence that Elijah met with the same patient thoroughness he brought to all questions from his children. Daniel was learning to walk with the determined, experimental methodology of a child who has identified balance as a problem and has decided to solve it through repetition, and had the particular relationship with Diego that third children often develop with steady presences, a wordless loyalty that Diego received with the quiet grace of a man who had been around long enough to understand what he was being given. In December of 1888, Lucy sat down and wrote a letter to San Antonio. She had thought about doing it for a long time, had discussed it with Elijah, who had said simply that it was her decision and he would support whatever she decided. The letter was to a woman named Mrs. Hollis, who had been the minister's wife in San Antonio and who had been kind to Lucy in the 2 years she'd lived there, kinder than was required by the situation, the particular kindness of someone who saw that a young woman was managing alone and chose to make that a little easier. Lucy had not written because she had not had, until now, the kind of news that wanted to be shared. She had had surviving, which was real but not the same. Now she had something else. She had Robert and Clara and Daniel. She had the new house on the east section with the porch all the way around. She had the account books and the cottonwoods and 6 years of Sunday walks. She had Diego's mustache moving in its suppressed smile and Rosa Acosta's laugh and a kitchen that was exactly the right size. She had Elijah, who had been tired of everything else for years and had never, not once, been tired of her, and who she suspected, though she would never say it in exactly this way because he would find it embarrassing and also deny it, had been waiting for her without knowing he was waiting. She wrote the letter. She said she was well. She said she was more than well. She said she had found the thing worth staying for, which was not a place exactly, though the place was remarkable, but a life she had built with someone who understood the entirety of who she was and had decided, with the settled clarity of a man who had seen enough of the world to know what he was choosing, that this was exactly what he wanted. She sealed the letter and went to find Elijah, who was in the barn with Carlos and Diego doing the evening check on the horses, and she stood in the barn doorway in the winter evening light and watched him, the way he moved in the space with the absolute comfort of a man who has been in this barn for 30 years and knows every board and smell and sound of it, talking to Carlos about something practical, his voice low and steady and familiar. He looked up and saw her, and his face did the thing. She thought about the day she had arrived, the broken wheel and the single battered trunk and the 17 cents, and the stranger in front of the livery stable who had wiped his hands on a piece of cloth and asked if she needed help. She thought about that woman, dusty and tired and braced against the possibility of hoping, standing in the middle of the street in the July heat of Millhaven, Texas, with a whole life ahead of her that she could not yet see. She thought about how the road there had been worth everything it cost. She smiled at him across the barn in the evening light. He smiled back, and it was exactly enough.